Hey everyone, it's Merja here from Sumiloff Academy of Human Integration, and welcome to this episode 2 of the Safe Spaces podcast. Um, and greetings to Farita, who's not feeling well. I hope you get well soon. So, unfortunately, Farita is not joining us today, but she has sent me the paragraph she'd like me to read and her questions as well. So, thank you very much, Farita, for being with us, even though you're not with us in person. I really appreciate you greatly. So let's get cracking. So the paragraph from the Safe Spaces book that we're covering today is in I believe it's in the introduction section, and it goes, you see, when you place value on something, you automatically place significance in yourself as the evaluator of that thing. Simply having an opinion on something makes you an authority in your own life. As a child with a narcissistic parental wound, I had a lot to learn about self-establishment and self-authority. Like many children of narcissistic parents, I had gotten used to only playing the role of a side character in my father's life. So conditioned to think of him first that I didn't recognize any of my own likes and dislikes. But Donut the horse helped me see myself as a real person. Instead of always looking to someone else for guidance and evaluation, Donut helped me learn to decipher for myself what was important for me and what was not. So, welcome to the second episode of the Safe Spaces podcast. That was a little excerpt from the Safe Spaces book that's just come out in early 2024. And today we're talking about self-establishment and self-authority, and how sometimes when we've had experiences as children that are not necessarily the most nurturing experiences for us, we can lose a side of ourselves. We can become a side character in somebody else's story. Whether they mean to do it or not is not really the point here, in my experience. It's what do we do after that? What do we do when we realize that we haven't actually established ourselves as a real person? Or we don't see that we have self-authority, and that is authority over the decisions that we make for our own lives. So that's what we're discussing today. And as per usual in these sessions, we're going to talk a little bit about what it looks like when somebody has self-establishment and self-authority well established in their everyday grown-up life. And then we'll look at how it shows up when it's not, in fact, showing up. And some of you might hear what I'm talking about today and realize, oh my goodness, I don't have self-authority, or I don't feel like I do. I don't feel like I have an established sense of self. And if that's what happens for you, please know you're not alone. There's a lot that can be done with that. So if you do realize that and you start freaking out, just reach out to us, desk@merjasumiloff.com, and we can point you into a direction of some really good tools. Okay, so firstly, every person should, in order to really be able to live a grown-up life where we're not just children running around in adult bodies, adult meat suits, every person who has maturity have realized that they are their own person. They're a sovereign being, and that sovereign being, if you haven't experienced childhood wounding, or if you haven't experienced this type of um, almost like shadow life as an extension of somebody else, it can be really difficult to understand why anybody would have a hard time making decisions or supporting themselves or making good decisions about finances and life and love. And you see a lot of people um, who haven't experienced self-establishment as the norm as a child. You see a lot of those types of people getting into, say, um, codependent relationships. They can be really bad with money, emotional spenders. Um, when I say they, I really talk about myself here as well, can be overgiving in all of their relationships and have a sense of responsibility that is too much too young, if that makes sense. So a lot of people who haven't felt like they've been able to establish themselves as a child actually feels like they had to grow up too quickly. And there within, for me, laid the first clue into realizing that I was a side character in somebody else's story, when I realized that, hang on a second, I didn't have a childhood really. I didn't have the kind of innocent childhood that I think every child deserves, for sure, uh, but also that sets every child up to really healthy sense of first separateness. So, um, the terrible twos or the crisis of opposition that every child needs to go through in order to establish themselves as a separate person. I didn't have that, and a lot of people who struggle with this also didn't go through this really big rite of passage for every person. And when that happens, we don't get ourselves first established as a separate person in order to then be able to belong as a separate entity into something bigger than ourselves. So we always kind of meld into life and meld into other people. And we meld into careers, we meld into, you know, professions that we think are better than other professions. We can become very prideful about our accomplishments. We can become competitive. We can become driven by things that actually don't end up making us happy. So when I'm looking at you valuing something, really something that actually makes you happy, that in and of itself places significance in yourself. So you become a significant person because you're an evaluator of that thing that's really important to you. But what if you end up evaluating things that don't make you happy? You tend to value things that other people think are important. And of course, that loses your sense of self even further. And a really, I'd say, exaggerated or a really deep version of this is when we get into abusive relationships because we don't actually believe that we have value. We don't believe that we deserve to be treated differently than how we're being treated, and that we get into those relationships time and time and time and time again because we're just used to being an extension of somebody else. So whether you're like me, that you might have narcissistic parental wounding, you might have emotionally unavailable parental wounding, you might have, for whatever reason. I know our parents did their best that they could, but sometimes they didn't, their best wasn't good enough to not leave us with some, shadow work to do. But whatever your feeling of not having the right to your own body, not having the right to your own voice, not having the right to your own thoughts, not having the right to your own career, your own reproductive health, whatever you want to um, claim your sovereignty back in. remember that that is actually your birthright. Now, you get to choose if you want to give that away. That's also completely your own decision. But you shouldn't, not shouldn't, because I don't really should or shouldn't. I don't think it's my place, but I'd like to encourage you to be aware. Be aware when you give yourself away. Be aware when you're playing a side character in somebody else's life, not because I'm condemning that, because I know from personal experience that sometimes the best thing you can do is to play the side character in that life, because it's not either safe to challenge that authority, or you don't have the skills to do it. So shaming yourself for that, or not being able to stand up for yourself, is not going to help your situation. So let's not go there. But if we look at whatever that childhood experience was where you felt like, hey, I can't have a sense of who I am. I don't know who I am. Then know that it's okay. Acknowledge that and then start learning some skills around that. You not having a healthy self-establishment as a child is not your fault. It is not your fault. You not being given tools to be your self-authority or any space for you to go through the terrible twos, that's not your fault. It is not your fault. And simultaneously, while you're saying, okay, these were the cards that life dealt me, you might consider doing something what I did, which was I just put those cards down and said, I'm going to pick my own cards. I didn't want to play the rest of my life with the cards that life dealt me. Why would I? It's so hard to be in one-sided relationships, always being taken advantage of and feeling like you're the victim of your life. It's really hard. Investing a lot of time and resources into a life of a victim is really hard, because much like with any other type of investment, when we invest our time in being a victim, it's really hard to stop investing that when the habit is there. And it's really hard to now invest in something else that contradicts potentially the victim existence that you've experienced. I know that from personal perspective. It can take 7 or 10 years to dig yourself out of the situation that you got yourself into. But having dug myself out of that situation, even though it took me about 12 years, even a year of not that makes up for way more than makes up for that 12 years that I had to go through to come out of it. So as I said, like many children of narcissistic parents, I got used to only playing the role of that side character, and I'd become so conditioned to only think of myself as an extension of somebody else. And if this is you, then let's start. Let me be your donut. Remember, Donut reminded me, he helped me see myself as a real person through my own experiences. Let me be that reminder for you. You have the power and the right to be who you are. So let's start deciphering what is and isn't right for you. So a fully healed person, what generally, or a person who has an experienced childhood trauma, like this type of self-establishment trauma, they don't have a hard time making good decisions in life. They tend to their life just tends to tick along, and they just tend to continue to grow and grow and grow, or their life continues to expand and expand. Or if you're really um, integrated and you like minimalism, then your life continues to shrink in terms of stuff, but it continues to expand in terms of meaning and joy and all those good things. So a person who is mature, who behaves in a mature way, who has their self-establishment and self-authority intact, they don't have to play games with other people. Now, you may have noticed that I don't judge my father. He did the best he could, even though, the damage was quite extensive. But I don't need to hate the guy. In fact, I know of quite a bit of our interactions really made me who I am today. And if you want to hear more about that, I talk about it in the Safe Spaces book. But even people who have had these challenges, they're integrated and they've matured through the process when they not only see that they have the power, they have the self-authority, they have they have established their sense of self, but they also know that nothing is wrong. Nothing happened that was wrong, even though horrible things happened. They have a sense of we have a sense of gratitude about what happened. And let me be really clear before you start typing that I'm, taking spiritual bypasses. We're talking about 12 years of serious work, integration work. So we're not talking about spiritual bypasses. Spiritual bypasses are those things when you feel like, oh yeah, I don't have the right to judge my parents, so I'm just going to say, no, no, it all just served me, everything's good, and pretending like you're okay when in fact you're not. So I don't condone spiritual bypasses. In fact, I've yet to meet a person who is integrated who consistently utilizes that tool. Having said that, that tool of a spiritual bypass in certain situations can be a very useful tool. And I'll give you an example right now so you can get a little bit of contrast. Let's just say that, well, actually, we don't have to, let's just say my father's mother passed away recently. And it brought up all kinds of things, as you can imagine. And I have a book launch coming up soon. And it would be very, very disruptive if I consistently focused on what I had lost and not what I am also simultaneously gaining. Now, I remember one particular morning I was having a pretty hard time and I was about to go into a meeting. And the team members asked how I'm doing because they'd known what had happened. And I took a spiritual bypass and I said, yeah, I'm good. It's all good. Nothing to nothing to get through. I'm just really glad that I had all of those experiences with her, good, bad, and indifferent. And yeah, we can just move on. And that was a spiritual bypass. And I used it as a tool because I knew that meeting, which was setting up the whole um, um, book launch event, had to be planned, it had to be put together. So had I not taken the spiritual bypass in that moment, I would have stopped 5 or 6 other people from doing what they needed to do in order to get everything organized. So when you're integrated, you can actually take spiritual bypasses and use them as a tool because you're conscious of what you're doing. But when you're not integrated, you're not even aware. You just think you're okay, or you just pretend that you're okay. And you might even feel like you don't have the right to not be okay. So that's what we're talking about when we look at an immature or unintegrated version, where we don't seem to process the grief and remember, in my case, this case, the grief piece, and remember grief also just can't, everybody's experience is so different, so nobody gets to say when you're integrated or when you're not. It's your experience, and please, stay with yourself and stay with your inner children as you're moving through those spaces. But pretending like you're a person when deep down you feel empty, that's how you know that there's some work to be done. Because once you get to the other side of that, once you get to a certain level of integration, you know who you are. You can speak your truth without offending anyone. You don't have the power games, which is what I mentioned before. You don't need another person to be wrong in order for you to be right, or if somebody says that, oh, you're wrong, you don't have the compulsion to say no and let me tell you why you're wrong. It's more like, oh, okay, yeah, good, let's just move on. It becomes a no factor. There's not a problem attached. There's no residue that you're left with after those interactions. You can just say, okay, that didn't work out as I wanted it to. Let's just move on, because I know who I am, so I don't have to defend my perspective. So if you look at relationships and you look at the general way relationships tend to play out, first you have the honeymoon period, which I'm sure you've experienced at some time, where you're full of feel-good drugs, oxytocin, and everything is just so wonderful and blah, 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 blah. And then you enter the second stage, which is the power struggle stage. And that power struggle stage is when we are actually no longer, we don't have access to those feel-good drugs, those feel-good hormones that were circulating through our bodies. Now we start seeing all the red flags, and now all our baggage comes to the game, and now we start pointing out red flags where there aren't any, and it just becomes this, who's right, who's wrong, who's in charge, who gets to choose. And it's that power struggle stage that really invites us to take our baggage and put it down on the table and look at it with another person. And once you move beyond the power struggle stage, you go into like what's called a power couple. And whether that's with 2 people or 3 people or however you love is fine, as long as it's, consensual and legal. You can really move beyond the need to be right in your relationship. It doesn't matter. You become unhurtable. You're just not hurt by the other person's behavior or conduct or attitudes or fears, or when they get triggered. You don't have to get triggered with them. You can just be their best friend and say, hey, tell me more of what's going on. Even when they're yelling at you, you're the problem, you're this, you're that, and you just see a person who is having a really hard time having a conversation other than what they're having. So once you establish yourself, and as I said, self-establishment can take a very long time. And once you have realized your self-authority, your sovereignty in this life, then your relationships change completely. You become trustable, and you realize who you can and can't trust. You don't place too much hope on some person being in a certain way, and then when they let you down, you don't take it personally because you didn't, put the hope on them to be perfect in the first place. You say, I would like to meet this person exactly as they are, and then I would like to be with this person exactly as they are, or I'd like to be away from this person exactly as they are. There's the need to protect yourself goes away. So that's what I wanted to cover today. So a healthy person who's had good self-establishment and self-authority doesn't need to defend themselves. They don't need to be in power struggles. They don't need to, be right. They don't need to fill in the blank. There's no need to defend or offend. Whereas an immature person, a person who is still struggling with these things, tends to end up in codependent relationships, tends to end up in similar relationships as they had in the past, and nothing seems to have changed. They tend to be in one-sided relationships. They tend to, think of themselves as the surgeon because that's more important, like one of our neighbors. First time I met them, they asked me what I do, and I said I do personality psychology and personality decoding. And they said, "Oh, I'm a surgeon. We don't have any use for that." So I just thought, it's funny because, you're what, 65, close to retirement, if not over. And you're so attached to your identity as a surgeon that you're not interested in having a conversation with your neighbor. So that was interesting. So let's get into Farita's questions, and let me just pull them up first so that I can get good representation here. Thank you, Farita, for these great questions. Okay. All right. So Farita is asking about the start point of my story. And it's kind of, to do with the Safe Spaces book. It's kind of self-explanatory in what I just read there, in ways of this book is really about self-establishment rather than anything else. And the starting point for the book is, the starting point for the story is, I'm trying to lay out what brought me to go on this journey. What prompted me to write something down? What prompted me to support other people as they're moving through their challenges in life? And why I wanted to write this book is not because I actually wanted to write the book. I was pestered into writing a book. It's a memoir, it's an autobiography, but it has a very high level of personal development within it. So anybody reading it, there's reflective questions in it. You can, take my story and what I've put down and superimpose into your own life and really look at those things for yourself and grow and take this journey with me as I'm remembering my journey. But what prompted me to get onto this journey was the thought that I don't want any future generation child, to have to go through this level of pain and insecurity that I went through. Even though I feel grateful that it all happened the way that it happened, there's a lot in the world that is not necessary. So if you think about the most incredibly inventive people in the world, a lot of them were actually highly supported as children. Their genius was embraced. And of course, there are a lot of people whose genius wasn't embraced as children, and they still went on to do great things. But if I think about those children, if I think about myself as that child, I can't help but feel that I want to protect her. And I have the same for all of humanity. So that's what prompted me to do this work. But what prompted me to write the book was I was pestered into it. In fact, I had a publishing deal 5 or 6 years before the book even came out. I was so resistant to writing it, but here we are. Okay, the next question. How How did narcissistic and emotionally distant parenting affect you? Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you for that, Freda. It really made me a lonely child. If you feel like, if you know narcissists or narcissistic people, you know that there's a dynamic of bullying, and there's a part of the whole dynamic where you're being isolated by this person. So first the love bombing phase, then the isolation phase, and then the real abuse really, really starts, like where you start to break down your sense of self if you were lucky enough or had enough good experiences as a child to have some level of sense of self. That's when that starts to break down. But the way that my childhood experiences or my parental experiences shaped me was I was a very lonely child, and I've always been a very lonely person. And because of that, then I can get into, or in the past now more than kind of current day, but I used to just get into really bad relationships or relationships that were not conducive to who I was as a person, because I take anything that was available. And that's not in any way, that is not in any way a dig on any of my past partners or any of my past friends that I'm not in touch with anymore. So please do not take it in that way. Um, I don't, it is what it is. But I got into situations and relationships and friendships where I wasn't a person. I wasn't a real person. So I went from loneliness to really clinging on to people to try and make them see me, which of course they didn't, because I'd do anything and everything so that they wouldn't reject me. So then I kept losing my own sense of self. So that's how it affected me mainly. But then on the positive, it's allowed me to really do this work as well. And finally, there's one more question here from Farita before we head on over to the Sumiloff Academy to do the second part, which is the personality decoding part of this session. And let me read this here. What kind of inner children healing have your clients experienced, and how has that changed their lives? Oh my goodness, that's a big question because there's so much. The I've worked with thousands of people. So if I take like a zoomed out statistical approach to answering this question, then it would be that the inner children of my clients have healed into realizing that they can have a voice. They're allowed to use it, but they're also given loving boundaries, which means that just because they have a voice and are allowed to use it doesn't mean that they get to completely, I don't even know what the exact, I'm trying to look for an exact word, but control your grown-up life. So we have this situation where we are grown-ups, we're adults, but we have these inner children that don't feel like they have the right to be who they are. And as long as that's there, as long as we ourselves don't attend to those inner children, it's almost like those inner children can run our lives in the background like a virus in your computer, or kind of malware, and then get you into really bad situations in your real life, in your real life can be inner life too, but in your outside world. And so when our inner children get through this, when we begin to really heal and the inner children start to feel that they are important, that's when we stop sabotaging ourselves in the outside world with relationships, with careers, with money, with our health, with addiction, all of those different things. And we begin to live a much more intentional and meaningful life, because now we're realizing what those inner children need, how they're feeling, what they need, and how we can give that to them so they can feel fulfilled and self-established. But as I said, this process can take years. It really depends on the severity of your wounds and the tools that you have available for you to get through this. And while I had some tools when I was working with this myself over the 12 years, the damage that was there just took a while for me to get into and really dig down deep into that space where I could then really start setting down new foundations and new foundations of me, of all the parts of me. So that's what happened there. And yeah, that's what I would say has been kind of the biggest common denominator with all the clients that I've worked with that have helped their inner children heal from this. Okay, so thank you everyone for joining on this second part 2 of the Safe Spaces podcast. My name, of course, is Merja Sumiloff. If you want to join us to do this work, please do. We'd love to have you at the Sumiloff Academy. And we are, you can find us at sumiloff.com. We also, obviously, you can get the book anywhere you want. If you want to support us the most, get it from Balboa Press, because we get the best commission margin in that way. But if you want convenience, you can head on over to Amazon or Barnes & Noble or anywhere indeed. Just Google Safe Spaces Merja Sumiloff book and you'll get your first preferences there. And it is, of course, available also as an ebook, so that can be a very good option for those of us who are maybe going through some budgetary challenges right now. So thank you so much for joining me at this session. And Farita, I hope you get well soon, and I hope you're getting a lot of rest. And I'm going to be heading over to sumiloff.com, our academy, our online academy, and continue to get into the personality decoding and reparenting of this self-establishment. All right, we'll see you at part 3 soon. Take care, look after yourself, and stay safe and create those safe spaces. Take care. Bye-bye.